kids who are brought up bilingual usually start talking later because they're processing two languages. And so usually when they start talking, it's later than kids who are brought up under one language.
Welcome to Transforming the Toddler Years, a Core 4 parenting podcast blending soul and science-based strategies to empower pandemic moms like you, raising kindergarten-ready kids. I'm Cara Tyrrell, your host, a lifetime lover of littles, girl mom, early childhood educator, and conscious parenting coach who truly believes that how we connect and collaborate with our kids in the first 5 years is how we raise world-ready kids who will change this world. Today's guest blew my mind, and I had a moment of realization of something that I could have done differently for my child for so many years. Steph West is a social coach who helps neurodivergent kids go from socially challenged to socially confident and connected. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in special education, and a master's in education administration. She has certificates in autism, behavior support, traumatic brain injury, inclusion, and transition, and has been supporting kids for over 20 years. But get this, she also has ADHD. So her neurodivergent brain understands what kids are going through and how they process differently than neurotypical people like me. This episode is so powerful as you send your kids back to school. If you start to notice any struggles, you will walk away knowing if it's time to seek a diagnosis, what the diagnosis will do for you and for them, and how to support them every day at home. Steph, thank you so much for being with here on our Back to School series. Back to School brings up all the social stuff, so we need you.
I am really glad to be here. Thank you for having me. And yes, I absolutely agree. Depending on how our kiddo's summer has gone, back to school can definitely be a time where we're questioning social, we're, readdressing social. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, listeners have kids of all ages. We know they have tinies that they're sending to preschool and kindergarten for the first time. So that's huge. But they also have older siblings who are kind of up leveling and heading to a new grade, a new stage, a new teacher, new people. So I am really excited to hear what you have to share with us today from your background. I mean, you have so much knowledge behind you, so many degrees, and I just love that you wrap it all up in a "it's okay to be different" package.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's interesting because I come from public education. And so I find the start of the new school year to be such a weird phenomenon because it's every year this event happens in the lives of parents and kids and teachers. I mean, there's not many people in the world, or in the US at least, that aren't affected by the start of the new school year. Even today on my front porch, my neighborhood left a sign with chalk for us to draw pictures and write messages to the kids as they're going back to school. This is the first year I've lived in this neighborhood, so I don't know if this is always something that they do, but back to school is such a big event, but it's also such a weird thing if you think about it, that our kids are starting over every year. Every year they're starting over. They have most likely a new teacher, unless they're in a really small private school or homeschooled. They have a new teacher. The dynamic of their classroom is different. They're magically in a different grade most of the time. Every few years they're at a different school. They may have moved. Their friends may have moved. I mean, it's just so interesting and so unnatural that every year we do this, but it's always starting over. I mean, there's always something about it that's different and new every year.
It's so true. And some kids handle it seamlessly and others really struggle. So we need to know from you all the things about neurodivergency. So it's a big buzzword right now. You see it everywhere. The hashtags are everywhere, but I don't know that I truly understand what it means, but even more specifically, as a mom, what I'm looking for to see if my child is going to be able to make these transitions independently or need a little bit of help along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Neurodivergence, it definitely is a buzzword. I was just on a podcast the other day and we were talking about how it's almost become hip for people to identify as neurodivergent. It's trendy, I think was the word that we were using. So I also identify as neurodivergent. I have ADHD. Neurodivergence is really just a big umbrella term for different brains, for people whose brains think differently. The most typical diagnoses that fall under the term neurodivergence are autism, ADHD, learning disabilities. Those are kind of the big three. Typically, if somebody identifies as neurodivergent, that's where they're falling. But really, it encompasses anything. It could be a brain injury. It could be, a genetic disorder. It really is anything that leads to somebody processing the world differently than a typical person processes the world. Speech disorders. There's just sensory processing difficulty. There's just so many things that fall under it. But as I said, the big three are autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, just because the numbers of those are much larger than a lot of the other things. One of the things that I think can be challenging, especially when kids are little, is really having an awareness of what is age appropriate and what is possibly something to be concerned about. I also think there's, in addition to that, if your child is an only child, it can be really difficult to even know what's age appropriate. If you have not been through this experience before, you may not even have a really solid understanding of what's age appropriate. Or if they're your oldest child, and your next child is several years younger, you might not really even have a good grasp of that. One thing that I recommend a lot is just looking at other kiddos who are about your child's same age. So if you're concerned about their language acquisition, if you're concerned about shyness, which actually, in my opinion, does not exist. Shyness is actually social anxiety. So definitely something to be aware of. If you're concerned about, they have a hard time getting along with other kids, that may be something that's typical of all kids their age. So just to be aware of that, look at other kids that are similar age to your child. Also, see if you can find other kids that maybe share your same culture, because that can have an influence as well. We have different social expectations when we have different cultural backgrounds. And so sometimes there may be things that our kids are doing or are not doing that other kids are or are not doing because they were brought up different, from a different cultural perspective. A great example of that is kids who are brought up bilingual usually start talking later because they're processing two languages. And so usually when they start talking, it's later than kids who are brought up under one language. But once they do start talking, they've got it, right? So I don't ever want a parent to feel like if they have a concern about their kiddo that it's not valid. Anything you feel is valid. But a great way to kind of assess that is to look at other kids and see, is this something that a lot of kids in my child's grade or age group or play group are having a hard time with? Or is it really just something that seems to stand out about my kiddo? And then again, looking at other kids who are similar to your child. Is this something that, my friends' kids are having a hard time with, or is my kiddo standing out because of it? So that would be my thought on that, is always trust your instinct. If you have a concern about something with your kiddo, don't allow other people's opinions to kind of, crush your instinct, but also look at other kids and see if you see similarities or differences that either contribute to your concerns or help you be a little more at ease that it's not just your kiddo.
I am so glad you brought this up. So, mamas, check this out. This amazing human being, Miss Steph here, says, I have ADHD, but you know what else she has? A bachelor's in psychology, a master's in special education, and a master's in education administration. So neurodivergency doesn't mean that you have less of a chance of achieving your goals or your dreams. And what I'm noticing about the way that you are framing things for us is it's through a very observational standpoint, because emotionally it can be really hard to look at your child and then look at other kids the same age and not get stuck in a comparison place and then a place of blame and what did I do or what didn't I do? So this observational, I'm just gathering information, and this information is going to help me make my next best decision. And I feel like that really leads us to the crux of this conversation, which is COVID babies and pandemic babies. Who were raised in a very different space than the generation before them, are exhibiting so many neurodivergent red flags. Are they really, or are they really just trying to catch up?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And again, I think that's why it becomes so important to compare. And when I say compare, I just mean look for similarities and differences. So compare your kiddos to other kids who are the same age, because you definitely will see that. We see the students that I work with are older, 7 and older. So, they were entering the school system during COVID, or they were already in the school system. And so a lot of what we see with kids who are now, transitioning into secondary school is that so much of their socialization was happening electronically and in their bedroom, right, as opposed to face-to-face in person. And so you can really see that for kids, especially during those formative social years, if they were preteens during those formative years, they are now struggling to read social cues, and they're struggling to form connections, and they're struggling to have actual conversations, because electronic communication is very different from natural organic conversation. But most kids are struggling with that as a whole, as a group, as a community. So it does not mean that one specific child might not be autistic or, have signs of a language disability, but it does mean that it's definitely something to take into consideration, is that this is something that has affected every child. And some of our kiddos, some people are naturally just really resilient and do really well with things being different, with things changing. They're very adaptable. And some people just aren't. And so you'll see that, right? And even if you have more than one child, you'll see that. You'll see that your kiddos probably have different personalities. And so that's our kiddos who tend to be more adaptable and resilient definitely, tend to suffer less losses because of COVID, because they've been able to kind of pick it up and bounce back. But some of our kiddos not only had the losses from being out of school and maybe being socially isolated, but they might not have recovered from that yet. And it might be more of a journey for them. I do tend to go off on tangents. I do have ADHD. So I do want to come back to what you said about the concept of neurodivergence. I think, obviously I'm biased, but people who are neurodivergent don't always do super well in traditional systems. I did really well in traditional school because everything was black and white and laid out, and I knew exactly where I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to be doing. But I did not do well at all in a traditional household. So my familial relationships, very strained. It was very challenging. But what I find with most people who are neurodivergent is once we are out of traditional school systems and out of traditional households, if that's, the way we're being raised, we do really well. A lot of entrepreneurs, which is what I am, a lot of people just making their own path. So neurodivergence, absolutely. It actually didn't occur to me until you said it, that people may think that neurodivergence can hold you back or be a challenge, because that's just not the way that I see it. But I'm really glad that you said that, because it helps me be able to put it in a different light, in a different context. It just means that we think differently, we process differently, we see the world differently, but that also usually means that our futures are going to be on a very different path and probably pretty non-traditional.
And how exciting is that? I mean, I said this to my girls all the time, if everybody was the same, the world would just be so incredibly boring and so uninteresting.
Yes.
So help us understand. Okay. So you said there were the top three, right? Those top three that diagnoses are typically given to. For parents who have 3, 4, 5-year-olds, what are some of those red flags? What are some of those symptoms, if you will, that they're going to be noticing in the ADHD sector, in the autism sector, or just, I guess they're mostly in general. I bet they overlap a lot. And then you go to your primary doctor and say, hey, do we need to take this further? But what are they looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. There is a lot of overlap. There's actually discussion about whether autism and ADHD are on the same spectrum. So there's both sides of that debate, as there is any debate. The main things I would say are, what are the things that seem to be really difficult or challenging for your kiddo that don't seem to be difficult or challenging for most other kids their age? So if you're looking at autism, it may be things like change. It may be things like doing things out of our habit or out of our routine. It may be kids who are autistic tend to start talking later. But once they do, they tend to actually have pretty advanced vocabulary. So your child may be 4 or 5 and talking like a child who's 8, for example. They don't always understand how to relate to other kids. And so they may struggle with playing with other kids. Those are things to look for if autism is a concern. It is a myth that autistic people do not want to be social. So that's a myth. Autistic people want to be social just as much as everybody else. It is just something that is more difficult for them because social is very nuanced. And so it can be really difficult for them to understand if they can join a group, how do they join the group? Does this kiddo want to play with me? Those kinds of things. So those are some things to be on the lookout for if autism is a concern.
I have heard that the inability to maintain eye contact is also an indicator. Is that accurate?
Inability to maintain eye contact can be an indicator of autism. It's also pretty common in ADHD. I actually really don't like maintaining eye contact. Even when we're doing this, I'm looking at myself, because when I am looking at somebody, I'm taking in so much visual information that it's very difficult to take in visual information and auditory information at the same time. And so if we're looking at somebody and trying to have a conversation, it's very hard to do both. And I've noticed that even about myself, I can have a much more effective conversation if I'm not looking at the person, because then I'm focusing on what I'm hearing. And I speak a few other languages, and I do best with my eyes closed, because then I can really concentrate on what I'm hearing and what I'm saying. If I'm looking at somebody and trying to speak one of my non-primary languages, I get overwhelmed with stimulation. So yes, lack of eye contact can definitely be associated with autism and ADHD as well for the same reason.
You just blew my mind. I'm going to tell you and everybody else why, and I actually feel a lot of mom guilt right now.
Oh, okay.
Because I have a daughter who has auditory processing disorder. And I knew something was up pretty early on. I'm a teacher, right? So I sent her to kindergarten. I said, something's not quite right. We need to do some diagnosing along the way. It took a while to get there because it's the last thing you test for out of the entire battery of SPED tests. But when we got there, I read up on it. I learned a lot about it. And I spent the rest of her childhood getting so frustrated that she wouldn't look at me when we talk. She still does. She's 18 now. Mm-hmm. And she still prefers, she's like, I can hear you just fine, Mom. And I literally say things to her like, it's really rude when you don't look at another person when you're talking to them. It's how we feel part of and engaged in the conversation. And now I'm like, how did I not know? How did I not put this together? That because the auditory processing is so hard for her, she couldn't handle the visual at the same time. I am going on record live on this podcast saying, I screwed up, moms. We all do.
Absolutely. I am not a mom, but I've been an educator for almost 20 years. Absolutely. We all are doing and saying what we think is best for our kiddos. And once we know better, we can do better, right? We are all doing the best that we can. There are definitely times where I have said or done things, and in hindsight, it was like, oh, that wasn't the best thing to say. So absolutely. And it's so much of social is a construct. It is these unwritten rules that society has decided are socially valuable. Things like making eye contact, right? It's a social construct. And so those are the things that you'll notice that kids who are autistic, kids who have ADHD, we don't always recognize and conform to social constructs. So things like, making eye contact, saying please and thank you, saying I love you, right? Like these are social constructs. I call them social niceties. There are things we do simply because they make other people feel good about us, right? So even if your kiddo doesn't say I love you, even if you say it, they don't always say it back. It's not because they don't love you. It's because that's a social construct. That is something that neurotypical people need. That those of us who are like, I'm single right now, but when I was married, I could live my whole life without my husband telling me that he loved me. I know that he loves me. I don't need him to tell me every day, right? But in the typical social world, it's a social expectation. And same with please and thank you. There's just so many, holding the door for somebody. I mean, there's just so many things that are social constructs that exist because we want other people to like us and to feel good around us. And if your kiddo doesn't pick up on these things and isn't doing these things, autism or ADHD are likely, right? Because a lot of them, we just don't see the point. I just don't see the point in doing that, right? But yeah, so the thing about eye contact, I don't ever require or ask my students to make eye contact. I do talk about having their body face the conversation, because if your body is facing the conversation, usually your head is facing the conversation, even if your eyes aren't, which is different than someone who's pacing around the room, right? Or has their body turned away. So I just talk about having your body in the conversation, even if your eyes are not. And a lot of this too is that a lot of the social information tends to be focused on neurodivergent people, when really it should be a two-way street, right? It should be, we need to be able to understand what other people consider socially normal, but other people also need to be able to understand where our challenges are, like eye contact, right? Other people need to be able to understand that if you want me to look at you, I'm no longer listening to you. You could have one or the other, So I think a lot of social interventions are focused on my kids, as opposed to it being more about everybody understanding each other,
This brings us back to where we started, where we talked about these massive social transitions when you're rewriting the rules, right? A new classroom means new engaging, how we relate to someone, new personalities. Okay, now I need a whole new construct. Just me checking in again. That's what I do. That's my job, to make sure that you feel lovingly supported every step of your journey. Some of you have already started the school year. Some of you are doing those last minute trips to the store to fill your lists and get ready, the new backpacks, the new lunch boxes. But all of you are dealing with increased level of stress, routine, overwhelm, and triggers. Have you registered for my live face to virtual face free workshop, Transforming Your Triggers? 6 simple steps to hijack those knee-jerk reactions and turn them into intentional, conscious responses. Not yet? Why? I know it's a busy time of year, but that's why I'm doing this. Because you want to navigate busyness with intention. You want to navigate higher levels of anxiety with higher intentions of calm. That's why this workshop is happening on September 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Can't be there live? No problem. There will be a replay. But if you want to make sure that your fall transitions are done with intention, grace, and consciousness, while you collaborate with your child to give them the skills they need to succeed in where they're going, this is the workshop for you. Register with the link in the show notes or go to caratyrrell.com/workshop, and I'll see you there. So a couple of questions together. How early is too early to pursue a diagnosis? And what is the point of one? What does it get you on the other side other than just the ability to say, my child has X?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically, kids are not diagnosed until they're at least 3. And that's also typically when early intervention services start. So kiddos who have a diagnosis can start school programs and therapies and things like that when they're 3. It depends on, I try to be really careful about using words like high functioning, low functioning, severity of symptoms, because all of that is completely relative and subjective. But there are kiddos who really show a lot of symptoms when they're very little. And then the parents are kind of just waiting until they're old enough for someone, to affirm what's going on. It could be, kiddos who don't ever respond to their name being called. Names are a social construct, right? Your name doesn't mean anything. And so that's a pretty kind of classic characteristic with really little kids, is when they just don't ever respond to their name being called. The rest of us do it because there's social validation in it, right? And so if you don't live off of social validation, there's no reason to respond to your name being called. So yeah, 3 is typically when kids are able to be diagnosed and able to start getting services. And that's what you'll typically see. Obviously, the kids who are struggling more with more severe symptoms, behavioral challenges are typically a thing that is evident pretty early on. Language delays. So a lot of kids enter the therapeutic school setting at 3 because of language delays, and then later may be diagnosed with something else. But it's, by 3, you can usually tell if your child's language is lagging, that kind of thing. And then now I'm going to try to remember. Oh, why does the diagnosis matter? Okay. I knew when you said I'm going to ask you multiple questions, I was like,
Before we get there, let's caveat that just a little bit, because if you're listening, then it's likely you have a 2, a 3, or a 4-year-old, because that's who the show is for. You have another layer here. So chances are you're experiencing some of this because of the start to life that your child had during the pandemic. So you don't have to panic right away or take too much affirmative action. However, I will say that because of this, kids who need true diagnoses and kids who are on the bubble but not quite recovering milestones yet are all falling into the same melting pot right now because they're all the same age. Mm-hmm. So here's what's happening is everybody is referring, and the referral process is taking so much longer than it normally would because there's so many referrals, so many more than there ever were before at a period of entering into preschool. So just know, unless you're seeing all of these buttons pushed, you're ticking all the boxes, chances are that you get your name on the list, but just keep getting your child out in the world, keep doing some social engagement, keep doing the observation that Steph recommended, keep being intentional and conscious with the way you're talking to them. And you might see a lot of improvement before your name even gets pulled for an assessment.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And so that actually ties in really well to your other question about what's the point of getting a diagnosis. I have a couple thoughts about that. I actually just got my diagnosis 2 years ago. And I've been doing this for 20 years. So that is pretty interesting. But I will say that getting the diagnosis was very reinforcing. It was very validating. And it also opens this whole community of people where you can, I'm in several very large Facebook groups for women with ADHD. I've had my business for 7 years now working with neurodivergent kids, but now it's very personal to me, right? And now in the last couple of years, all my students know that I have ADHD because it's very important to me that we are able to relate on that level, right? That I'm teaching them the things I'm teaching them because I understand it, because I'm there with them. So I do think diagnosis really validates our experience as a neurodivergent person. If your child is old enough to recognize that they are struggling with things that other kids aren't, it could be academics. Maybe they're really having a hard time with reading and they notice that the other kids aren't. It could be that they're really having a hard time paying attention and they keep getting in trouble. It could be, when I was 4, I was having meltdowns at home, like physically aggressive meltdowns. I was eloping. So your kiddo pretty early on will recognize that they are having a hard time with things that other kids don't seem to be having a hard time with. I mean, I'm talking like 5 years old. They can start to see that. And so getting a diagnosis is a really validating process for us because it gives context to why things are the way they are. It also allows us to find our community. In my program, all of my students are neurodivergent and they very openly talk about it. So sometimes kiddos come in and their parents have not told them. And so I just talk about it generally, but most of my students are aware of their diagnoses and they talk about it very openly. And I think that's amazing. So those are a couple of the reasons. It also helps you as the parent. It helps their teacher. It helps, people like me who are supporting them in other ways really know how to best support them. It really helps us know. In my program, I have my own curriculum for social. And so it's the same whether kids are autistic, ADHD, have a learning disability. The curriculum's the same, but the way I talk to different kids is a little bit different based on how I understand that their brain works, right? So I'll talk to an autistic kiddo a little bit differently than I would talk to a kiddo with dyslexia, just because I know that they're processing things differently. So those are all the reasons I think a diagnosis is important, is that it validates the experience that your child has had. It opens the door for them to find other people that they relate to and connect with. And it also allows everybody on your child's team, including you as the parent, to have, it almost gives you a direction, right? And then we got to put the map together to get there. But it really helps us all understand the reasons behind what's challenging for our kiddos. It also, I guarantee you, even for me, when I got my diagnosis as a very adult person, you will learn things that you didn't know were a struggle for your kid. And that even happened for me in my own process. I learned things that I didn't realize not everybody struggled with. Even at the age that I was when I got diagnosed 2 years ago, I was like, I did not know that not everybody's brain does this thing that my brain does. So all those reasons.
So good. And, I'll just tag on. We're both teachers here. We're both in that educational sector. I was a teacher sending my kid through this educational process, teacher to teacher to teacher. Mm-hmm. The benefit of the diagnosis for me was it empowered me with a piece of legal paper, right? An IEP that I was able to stand behind and require each new grade or each new school to uphold for the betterment of my child. Long story short, public education worked until 6th grade for my girl, because we live in a tiny rural town where the class size was small enough that the teacher could do exactly what you're talking about and meet her needs. Once she moved up to our high school, which actually runs 7 through 12 in one building, the wheels fell off. Found her a private school that met her where she was, asked her to be part of her own learning journey and advocate for herself when she felt confused or misunderstood. And she is now, this is like just Brent, at the time of this recording, this literally just happened. Yesterday, she interviewed on a Zoom call with a family in Japan and said, I would love to be your au pair. And they said, will you come work for us for 18 months? And so my child, who once was shy, I know you don't love that word, my Velcro child, right? Who said literally out loud as a child, I'm never leaving this house. I'm never moving out. I'll just live in the guest room for the rest of my life, is moving to Japan to start her life, her evolution of self, because we allowed her disability to become an empowered part of her story. It just blows me away.
That's so amazing. Congratulations, Mom. Oh, that's so amazing. Yeah. And look at her following a non-traditional path.
Exactly.
Right? That's not the traditional thing that you do.
No, not usually. We're so excited for her. But this is exactly why I really want everyone to walk away with a bunch of things today that we've talked about. But more than anything, if you pursue and get a valid diagnosis, don't let that be the end of it. Don't drop it in the lap of your local school district and expect them to do everything they need to do, because the only person who loves your child that much and cares that much and is willing to put everything they have into raising a human being that can take on the world, even with disabilities, is you. So you've got to advocate for them and you've got to find what works. And if it's working, great. And if not, there's resources like Steph out there. So Steph, tell us your number one social strategy and then tell us how to find you and work with you if it's something that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. So the number one thing that I really love to teach, and I'm going to preface this by saying, most people who are neurotypical, meaning you don't have autism, ADHD, whatever.
That's me.
Yeah. My primary audience is moms. So most neurotypical moms, when I share this strategy, cannot possibly imagine that this works and have a lot of reluctance to even trying it. So I'm just going to preface it by saying that. However, this is my number one strategy that I use with my students. And I wish that more people would use it with me. And I've even used it in Facebook conversations with people I do not know and had it be really successful. So just going to preface it by saying, I totally understand if you hear this and think I could never, but for those of us who are neurodivergent, it is exactly what we need. And so I just want to ask you to try it. Even everything that works for people who are neurodivergent also works for people who are not. That's the funny thing about it. So here's the strategy. This is how I teach my students to become more socially aware. So instead of teaching isolated social skills, which make our kids robots, I teach kids how to be more socially aware of what's going on around them. And then they can decide how they want to respond or interact or whatever. So I have 3 words that I use. And my goal is not to change what's happening in the moment. My goal is to help my students be able to make a different choice next time if they choose to do so. So the first thing I'll say, let me think of a great example of something that might happen. So because our audience today is younger kids, let's say that we have kids playing together and somebody takes something from somebody else, right? It's a pretty common scenario for younger kids. Somebody takes something. So the first one that I do is it's just noticing. Okay. So what I am trying to avoid myself is I'm trying to avoid telling anybody what to do, because that does not work. Even as an adult, I don't do well with people telling me what to do. So I'm trying to avoid telling anybody what to do. I'm also trying to avoid placing any kind of judgment on anything, because the truth is there's no behavior that's inherently right or wrong or good or bad. It's all contextual. So taking something from somebody else, there are contexts where that's exactly what you need to do, right? So just to be clear, there's no behavior that is right or wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to notice in a very flat affect, no emotion. I'm going to say something like, oh, I noticed that Katie was playing with that red car and you just took it out of her hand. That's it. That's exactly what happened. 5 people could observe and they would have the same comment, right? That's exactly what happened. So there's no emotion to it. There's no blaming. There's no labeling. It's just what happened. And the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the word wonder. Wonder is an amazing word because, again, there's no judgment. There's also no conflict. I'm not trying to start an argument. I'm not trying to say I'm right, you're wrong. I'm just trying to help my kiddo be more socially aware. That's my goal. Okay. So I noticed that Katie was playing with that red card and you took it from her. The second one is wonder. So this is, and you can go wherever you want to with these questions. So I'll just give you some different variations. I wonder if Katie still wants to play with you if you take things out of her hand. Another option could be, I wonder what you could have said to Katie if you wanted to play with that red car. I wonder if Katie might want to go find someone else to play with who asks for things instead of taking them. I wonder if there's a way that you could let Katie know that you would like a turn with the red car, right? So you can go wherever you want to with this. So notice, wonder, and now you've planted the seed in your kiddo's brain, right? You've let them know the situation and how it has affected the other person in the situation, but without making them feel bad or wrong or whatever. And then the third one is think. And again, you can go wherever you want to with this. You can even say, like, what do you think about that? You can say, what do you think you might be able to say to Katie if you want to turn with the red car? You can say, what do you think Katie might do next? You can say, what do you think Katie might do next time she has a choice of who to play with? Right. So you can go anywhere you want to with it, but it's those 3 terms in that order. And then at the end of it, you can walk away, because the goal is not to even have a conversation about it. That's not even the goal. The goal is to plant the social awareness seed in your kid's brain, that when we take things from people, they don't always want to play with us again, right? But you're also planting the seed of, I wonder what you could say to her. I wonder what else you could try. If your kiddo is open and receptive to it, you could do a role play. I wonder if you could say to Katie, can I play with that car? Right? Do you think you want to try that? So you could even turn it into a role play. The most important thing is to not expect anything to change right now, because it's not about right now. It's about next time. To not use this as a power struggle conflict situation. That we're definitely trying to do the opposite of that. But this is how I talk to my kids all the time. And the kids who've been with me longer, all I have to do now is the notice, and then they figure it out and they take it from there.
Wow, that really sounds so much like what we do here at Core 4 Parenting in our responsive language and we use it with tiny people, and you serve kids who are 7 and older and still struggling, because we're using it to support them to develop the social skills and some self-identity. Mm-hmm. And you're using it to help kids engage when they've bypassed the traditional age for mastering that skill and are still struggling with it. Unbelievable. So for families who have kids who are 7 and older and are listening or know people who need this, how can they find you, and where do they go? What do they do?
Yeah, I teach social groups on Zoom. So that's what I do for kids who are neurodivergent. And it's a combination of my curriculum that I created, and we do game time together as well. And so my website is starfishsocialclub.org. You can get to my Facebook page from there. You can get to my podcast from there, my YouTube channel. There's some free resources. So that's where I am, starfishsocialclub.org.
Do you hear that? Another podcast to go subscribe to. That's fantastic. Thank you, Steph, for spending your time with us today, sharing all your wisdom and knowledge and opening some neurotypical minds. We really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you are enjoying our back to school mini series that will run all through the month of August and the beginning of September. Topics that are relevant to where you are and what your kids are going through right now as you start full-time daycare programs, preschool enrollments, and even those first few days of kindergarten. Please take a moment and scroll down, rate and review the show. Let people know what you love about it, and leave me a note of an episode topic you would love to see me record. Until next time, stay mindful and proactive as we raise school-ready kids who will change the world.